Hi, everybody. So, as I showed on the first video, kind of like this introduction, to things that really interest me and are part of what I do. I wanted to start kind of like Black history. I would say moments, but history is a continuous developing thing, and discipline has legs of its own. But like I said, I just like for people to know about things. You never know when somebody starts searching for themselves, for who they are, how history can really inspire. Okay. And, I'm all into the making sure that Black people feel empowered by their history. I am not into, however, pretending like Black people have not had a history of struggle and pain and dealing with racism. I think people have tried to go to the extreme and say, oh, they just get so tired of hearing about slavery. And I get it. I get it. We do have to take breaks and things like that, sometimes for our own mental health. But also, the truth is the truth. And we cannot pretend like that isn't the case. This whole concept of Black joy, this, that, and the other. I think that's great. I think, as far as I'm concerned, that started in church over a century ago in the Black African American church. So, anyway, I said to say, I'm not here though to only share things that are nice and happy, but also things that Black people have persisted through. Okay. All right. So, anyway, pioneers of the early Black medical movement is going to be my first one of these. So, I hope you all enjoy, and please use this information as necessary. Um, make sure you give me my credit. Also, though, no, just so people are learning, right? And it could be college students, it could be adults who just want to kind of get up on stuff. So, pioneers of the early African American medical movement. I know some people probably don't even know about this. One of the things I think that are really important is, even as we talk about the health of Black women or the lack thereof, lack of access to health care. I mean, when Serena Williams couldn't get what she needed in the doctor's room, as she gave labor, as a multimillionaire, as an Olympic winner, and nurses who aren't even in her tax bracket, have her pedigree of any sort, felt comfortable to deny her those things because she's a Black woman and I can ignore her. And I think it's important for us to know that the things that have happened to Black people in denial of education, access to resources so we can be in those rooms to help and support each other, and also what white people need to learn so that they stop doing that, because they are wrong. Period. All right. That there have been people that have gotten through this. So, the National Medical Association, and one of the things that is important to point out, it's been here since 1895 in the United States. The National Medical Association was African American founded by African American doctors, but African American doctors who have been denied entry into the American Medical Association. All right. So typically, when we hear associations that start with national, they have a tendency to be primarily in history Black organizations, not American, not like white dominated organizations. And he had to create them because they were isolated. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the National Baptist Convention, the National Black Baptist Women's Convention. These are all things that are created, National Urban League, for Black people because they had been isolated in regular social channels to kind of make the progress that they wanted to politically, economically, medically, educationally. So that's just something to keep in mind. But Black doctors got together and helped found this association. It is still in practice today. Those of you who are in the medical field, I encourage you to join, and just be aware. All right. So the National Medical Association, as we can see here, these are the founders who took a picture in Ohio. And you can always look these sort of things up, but I like to make sure I'm guiding people like I would, a regular student. All right. So one thing you need to know is that this is the nation's oldest and largest organization that represents African American physicians. And as a result, that means it's the first, right? It's established in 1895, like I mentioned. And this was during an era of history, and I'm just kind of glancing at my notes. So if you see me looking over, that's what I'm doing. when the majority of African Americans were disenfranchised in every shape, way, and form, and were under the constant threat of violence. Some of y'all like, that's today. Knock. Okay. All right. So Jim Crow laws dominated employment, housing, transportation, recreation, education, and medicine. And so, one, getting through school and becoming a Black doctor in and of itself is a radical act. These people were not becoming, they were becoming doctors certainly for a love of medicine, to help with the life of the mind, and moving forward. But these were also doctors who were researchers and who had planned to come back to their community. Yes, you can argue, well, because Black people had segregated hospitals, if they had a hospital anywhere near them. But also because they cared about their community. And so when I hear people say money over everything, that always bothers me. And I totally get the need for money, but we have to have some kind of sense of self and also care for the self of others. And that's why I'm inspired by things like this. Okay. So moving on. All right. So left out. Okay. No, Vanessa Simmons is not. I just like to use gifts sometimes. All right. So the American Medical Association had been restricted to whites only. Now, we know, or maybe we don't know, that when things become restricted to whites only, the intention was always to isolate Black people, okay, to ensure it wasn't always that way, because the idea that there would be Black doctors, it wasn't necessary to make that point. But after slavery, it was necessary to make that point. All right, they were afraid, and they weren't even building schools like that for Black people. They just got nervous on it. All right. So the American Medical Association, Black doctors were denied admission. And a lot of these Black doctors applied year in and year out, and they could not get admission. And what they really wanted, it's not simply, so you can rub elbows with other doctors, which is what you need to do in a profession. Teachers should know other teachers. Lawyers should know other lawyers. Politicians have to know other politicians, whether they agree with them or not. These are also the places where medical research is happening. So if you can't get access to those documents and access to research studies, it puts you in a position where it's difficult to find out the newest research, the latest technological advancements to help people live. And in this case, Black communities live. All right. So it was created. The AMA really determined medical policy for the country and played this incredible role in broadening the expertise of physicians, like I said. And so by being denied this was really difficult. So then they decided to create the NMA, the National Medical Association, for Black doctors and health professionals who found it necessary to work together so they could establish their own medical societies and hospitals and find out where hospital deserts are, if you will, so that they could try to create some sort of pipeline. And it was still difficult for Black doctors just to even get into medical school, to go to medical school, to pay for it, because we never got our reparations. But these are people who are giving really of themselves. All right. Now, priorities of the National Medical Association. All right. They set down, this is what I mean by it's fine to take care of oneself, but to not see yourself as the only person that needs to be taken care of. So they set out a list of priorities. They look at the inadequacies of a segregated healthcare system. And as Martin Luther King said in the 60s, when he was making a speech in Chicago, whenever you segregate someone, you inevitably discriminate against them. There's no such thing as separate but equal. That the whole point of, if that was the case, if everything was equal, there'd be no reason to separate it. So there's these inadequacies of a healthcare system that leaves Black people neglected purposely. They don't want them to stay healthy, especially now that they are not of the same sort of economic use they were as slaves. That means you could just completely disregard their humanity. And if you ran out of slaves, you would force breed more, particularly as it was in the US. So priority items for them were how to eliminate health disparities, to attain professional medical care for all people. And Black people have been the bedrock of this movement, even though we are always people that get shafted. There are other minorities. Black people don't keep other people out of their associations. And there are other minorities that have been able to either immigrate or even immigrate and pass, even though they may come from Latino countries, Latin American countries or parts of Southern Asia, and they don't pay homage to these Black doctors who offered an opportunity and association where they still couldn't make those connections then or now. All right, so shout out to the NMA. But these were their original priorities, and they're still doing this kind of work today. All right, so inadequate health care. These are things that we might hear about. We don't know the details, we just know it's true, right? So they outlined a series of different things. Racism in medicine had always been the case, all right? The practicing on Black enslaved women by white so-called physicians through their uterus, through their vagina, through their breast studying, and them having no consent to do so. And that was, of course, why chattel slavery is so different. People say, well, slavery had an element around with it. It's just another bit. No, chattel slavery was the owning of human persons as property. Indeed, that means the documents and in legal policy. And people, you know, in the words of Paul Mooney, Black people got away and white people are still not over it. If you want to go back and forth, by all means, tell me why this is not the truth. So there were poor health outcomes for Blacks and other minorities. In the South, hospitals were substandard, or they didn't exist at all for Black people, okay? And that's because the federal government never really funded, or Congress didn't vote for them to continue to fund resources by the Freedmen's Bureau after slavery. And health is central to everything else you can do. All right. And when Black people were allowed in the hospitals, this is before they kind of upped their segregation game. They were relegated to all Black wards, so they could just effectively ignore them. Right. They didn't accidentally walk in the room and go, "Oop, nope, never mind." Like, no, they wanted to make sure that these people who they no longer can exploit for free labor, particularly after slavery, they don't matter to me the same way. And we're still dealing with the effects of that. Okay. All right. Okay, so some of the other things that we need to outline, because, you know, we always had this attitude, and like I said, I'm from the state of Georgia. I love my home state despite its problems. Shout out to the ATL. Northern states had inequitable health care by race as well. They were just a lot more sophisticated about it. And we've all heard of redlining, not allowing Black people to buy homes in certain neighborhoods. Shout out to A Raisin in the Sun by Lorraine Hansberry. White schools, white neighborhoods, Asian communities, Asian neighborhoods. So they're deciding, but they are still actively isolating Black people from their admissions policies in terms of college, in terms of medical school, where they can live, how much money they can make. By 1912, only 19 of New York City, where I lived for many years, New York City, only 19 of the 29 hospitals would even admit Black patients. Okay, and so when we say admit Black patients, we mean one or two at a time, or just one, and that's only, they didn't have it on the books that they wouldn't accept them. But people can still discriminate against you and not let you in. This is by 1912, when everybody else is bragging about the progressive era and how things were changing and the different opportunities immigrants were getting as we moved into World War I, or it may have stopped a little bit because of World War I, but they had kind of had these opportunities that other people didn't have. Yeah, okay, well, Black people were still at the bottom of the totem pole. And I don't want to make this the oppression Olympics, but I am making a point that racism is an American thing. It's not a unique phenomenon of the South. Now, the South deserves its dirty, wretched place in history for enslavement of African people, which we are still dealing with the effects of. But the South could have never gotten away with this long. I can't say this enough. Could not have gotten away with 2.5 centuries of slavery if everybody else in America was just so against it. Only 4% of people living in the United States ever owned slaves. They owned up to 4 million, more than anybody else in the Western world. But only 4% actually owned them, and they owned a lot. So that means everybody else, especially poor whites, don't benefit at all Because why would these enslavers hire you when they can take Black people who people recognize in public because of their skin, exploit them for free, or pay you? So if anything, and many of them by the time of the Civil War do start to kind of catch on, oh, this is ruining job opportunities for us. But they still believed in white supremacy. That's why you still have this by 1912. But Black doctors persisted. Okay. All right. So the NMA agenda, and I just want to highlight some of these things because I want you to know that there are Black people like doing it then and now. One, they wanted to know how to address the healthcare needs of a population that by 1912 exceeded 10 million people. So there were 10 million Black people that had been accounted for. We're not talking about Black people who wouldn't fill out the census papers, who Du Bois didn't catch when he was doing the Philadelphia Negro. We're not even considering all those people who haven't. At that point, they had 10 million on record. They wanted to know how to increase the number of minority physicians needed to adequately treat them. And this, to me, people keep throwing around this diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is all a bunch of BS a lot of times. People don't intend to hire Black people. They intend to acknowledge that racism exists. They may hire a Black person, but that's the point. They hire them like one at a time or two at a time in two different spaces of a company, of a school, and then isolate them and make them feel like they don't want to work there and say, well, we hired them. We don't know what happened, right? So they want to increase the number of minority physicians needed because they know Black doctors have to help heal Black people. Shout out to them. All right, so how to improve the overall health of the Black population was their goal. So NMA members set up their own hospitals. They emphasized physician training and appointed special commissions to study. That means individual, like groups of doctors to look at different kind of things like heart attacks, heart disease, forms of cancer, infant immortality, to figure out concrete ways they could write down in these NMA journals that they would disseminate to other Black doctors across the country to help Black people. And tuberculosis was a huge one, even in the early 20th century. So, organizing and organization around this, and I really, really like to encourage this because people say, and I said this before, I feel like it's like 50-50. It's 50% of Black women who say, yeah, Black women should stick together. Black women should stand up for each other. And then there's like another 50% who say that and then are always trying to pull the rug out from other Black people, sit on, what do you call it? Hiring committees, and then want to talk about all the information Black people don't have, or try to be friends with the other Black girl at work. It didn't go back. And, a Black girl have a moment, and I know because I've been one, and they're trying to find out from you, one, your ideas, use them as their own, or two, go back and play, white person spy on you. And it's not cool. It's not cool. And so when I see these kind of organizing examples, it gives me encouragement, especially knowing that sometimes I just feel like, you know what, forget it. I'm not going to work with anybody because I don't trust people anymore. But these sort of things are still here. And I think God does that. I think God helps us sometimes so we don't get so discouraged that we give up. Because it's only by the grace of God that we're still here as a people. All right. So the Journal of the National Medical Association, if you're ever interested, started in 1909. And like I said, the reason why they wanted to be a part of the AMA was really because why did I put this Bart Simpson thing? They wanted to be a part of the AMA because of the research studies, but instead they start to do their own. And shout out to Dr. Charles V. Roman. He was the editor of the JNMA. And it was scholarly research findings regarding the prevention, the treatment, the management, and the care of illness and disease were reported quarterly. Okay, so what? That's like 3 times a year, every 4 months. So it was awesome. All right, Black doctors breaking barriers. Okay, I'm not even here for Obama like that. I have a lot of problems with Obama, but I just always find this get funny. Anyway, and it wasn't real. He didn't actually do this. All right. So here's a name that all of you should know. And if you don't, that's what I'm here for. Daniel Hale Williams, Dr. Daniel Hale Williams, was considered a Moses in a profession. And we've seen this before. When we talk about Harriet Tubman, the Moses of her people, parting the ways and leading people to freedom, he was parting those barriers as much as he could. to ensure Black health care. It's a picture of him. You should look him up and look up other things written on him. All right. And this is a quote from him. A people who don't make provision for their own sick and suffering are not worthy of civilization. Daniel Hale Williams, MD. Now, this is a particularly important quote as far as I'm concerned, because I see this as a read on white people, because we're all humans. And the way they isolated Black people, and Dr. Kenneth B. Clark later in the 60s will talk about the history of racism against Black people in America as a reflection of how white people feel about themselves in his book, Dark Ghetto. So a people who don't make provision for their own sick and suffering are not worthy of civilization. And it's also a call to action. Now, I think that's a little harsh on other Black people, but it's a call to action to ensure that Black doctors, Black people are doing what they can to ensure the health of other Black people. All right, that's a lot, because the racism that Black doctors have to deal with, and knowing that they have individual issues just with racism, have their own families and lives, and they have to look out for people, that's a lot. All right, so a little background on Daniel Hale Williams. I'll just touch on some things. So in 1856, he was born. He dies in 1931. God rest his soul. Best known for achievements in surgery. Okay, he is what we now know. He was the first person to perform open heart surgery. The first person, not the first Black doctor, the first person, and he did it by doing a second repair of a stab wound to the pericardium, which is the sac around the heart, in 1893, when a Black man in Chicago had been stabbed with a knife, and he tried to heal it. And so he had to open up his skin and do the open heart surgery. And that man, not only did he really, it would have been a lethal wound had he had any other doctor. Nobody had done this before. And 51 days after being in the hospital, James Cornish was the man that was his patient. He walks out, and he lives for over 20 years after that surgery. Daniel Hale Williams is the original GOAT. He did that with the AMA isolating him. He did that struggling to get an education because Black people just had to struggle for stuff, and still took a chance. But to save this man's life, he didn't look at him and say, oh, here they go out in the street again. And that's why we got to be careful with stuff like that. All right. The work of Daniel Hale Williams, and yes, I'm going to spend some more time on it because I get ahead of myself sometimes. So Providence Hospital, the first Black-owned and created hospital in America. This is what I'm talking about, innovative. So Providence Hospital still exists in Chicago. He inspected the pericardium, which I explained was the sac around the heart. After 51 days, James Cornish was a hospitalist for 20 years. Shout out to him. All right. Now, some of his individual accomplishments, Dr. Williams, he started Providence Hospital in a training school for nurses in Chicago. So what he did was he started his own hospital after witnessing so many of the disparities of Black people. He was the chief surgeon of Freedman's Hospital in Washington, D.C., which is now Howard University's hospital. Shout out to him. There were a lot of free Blacks in D.C., but being a chief surgeon, he had been a man of practice and dedication. He helped over time reduce mortality rates. At Freedman's Hospital in 1895, he was one of the first founders of the National Medical Association. In 1913, he became the first African American to be inducted into the American College of Surgeons. Okay, this is almost 20 years after he had helped found National Medical Association. And yeah, he was inducted because they had something to gain with his induction. He did what nobody else can do. He took that chance because he's a smart man. But he also didn't forget about other people. He started a hospital back home in Chicago, and then used this opportunity to help train other Black people. That is no easy feat. Y'all got to realize this is no easy feat. And this is why I think this is so important for us just to know, because that can really, a kid knowing this, an adult knowing this, can really change the way you look at yourself in your life. All right, Charles Richard Drew, MD, father of the blood bank. Okay, so here he is, another Black man, and that's a picture of him. Another man associated with Howard. So here's a quote from him. While one must grant at once that extraordinary talent, great intellectual strength, and unusual opportunity are necessary to break out of this prison of the Negro problem. We believe that the Negro in the field of physical sciences has not only opened a small passageway to the outside world, but is carving a road in many untrod areas, along which later generations will find it more easy to travel. The breaching of these walls and the laying of this road has not been and is not easy. Dr. Charles Drew. So he's clearly stating that what Black people go through, yeah, I'm enduring this, but I'm enduring this hoping that those who come behind me won't have to deal with it. But he's admitting how heavy this is on him. And this is why I get so frustrated with this light skin, dark skin foolishness. And somebody will see it like, well, you're lighter complexion. I'm not negating any experiences that happen to darker complexion people. I am saying that colorism, however, is very subjective. Somebody can be arguably light skinned. They can be arguably dark skinned. They can be arguably brown skinned. It depends on where you grew up and what you saw. But don't take away from somebody else's Black struggle, okay? Because Charles Drew was treated like a you-know-what and still kept fighting. And what he said can still be true for Black doctors today. So Charles Drew died relatively young. He was born June 3rd, 1904, dies April 1st, 1950. Once again, God bless the dead. Amherst College in Massachusetts is where he went to school. Now, the thing about Charles Drew, he was a native of Washington, D.C. Like I said, there were a lot of free Blacks there, particularly before slavery, and then a lot of Black people moved there after slavery. He was one of only 13 African Americans, though, in a student body of 600 people at Amherst College, okay, where the racial climate exposed him to the hostility that he would endure throughout his study for education and in medicine. All right. And Drew aspired to continue training. He wanted to look at transfusion therapy at the Mayo Clinic. And the Mayo Clinic, we know sometimes people go to the website and they're like, oh, the Mayo Clinic. No. This was a serious place where doctors went to train. And that was one of the places he had aspired to train. Now, as far as his background as a person, these are some of the things you need to know. American medical centers barred Black scholars and Black doctors talking and discussing about the problems African Americans experience and the discrimination and abuse that they experience in medicine. All right. So in this process, he instead ended up joining the faculty at Howard University's College of Medicine. He became, and walking in the steps of Daniel Hill Williams, surgical instructor and chief surgical resident at Freedman's Hospital. So this is why I hate to even have to defend why HBCUs are necessary. But even then, it provided a place of safety, acceptance, real talk admission based on your skills, and gave Black people an opportunity to become better and to help serve. Okay. So some of his major scientific achievements, just like I touched on with Dr. Hill Williams, he was a renowned surgeon and pioneer being one of the first in the preservation of life-saving blood plasma. When people have blood transfusions today to save their life because they don't have enough blood, shout out to Dr. Charles Drew. The primary purpose of plasma for all my science people and my non-science people is to transport nutrients and hormones and proteins to the parts of the body that need it, particularly when they don't have it. So he comes up with a system for long-term storage of blood plasma. So in these events where Black people and other people all across America and eventually all across the world need blood when they're losing it, because he comes up with this in the midst of what? World War II, when they were segregating Black soldiers and telling them they didn't have a place in the fight. My grandfather also served in World War II. May he rest in peace. Samuel Jefferson, Pop Nicholson. Okay, so even while this is happening, Black people being discriminated against, but these sort of blood plasma centers are like where the American Cross gets this idea from. All right, they borrow from him. They discovered a method of long-term storage, and just so you know, plasma is the largest part of the blood. It's 55% of it. That's why it's important that your body has it. His achievements continue because he's bad like that. He was created America's first large-scale blood bank. And he was looking at ways to preserve blood during World War II, as I said, because people are obviously in these situations across the world where they're losing blood. And so storage techniques that he comes up with, the American Red Cross adapts, okay, borrows, steals, appropriates. Okay, now, yes, it's for the sake of life, and we don't want to take that away. But I am saying that Charles Drew is a name that people should know, and they should know that he's Black, and they should know the circumstances with which he had to come up with this stuff. All right. So, like I said, the program becomes a model to produce dried blood plasma in New York in February 1941. Drew becomes assistant director at the Red Cross, and among his innovations was something called blood mobiles. And this is like, you know, when you stop at a truck and you get blood, he started this. National Blood Donor Service, once again, started by a Black person. National indicates that it's a Black person in charge, because the American stuff, like the American Red Cross, Black people weren't even allowed in. Check this picture out. All right. So the blood mobiles were mobile blood donation trucks with refrigerators to preserve it and to make sure people had it wherever they needed it. Okay. So he's known as the father of the blood bank. All right. And let me tell you how racism works. Ironically, just like they wanted his ideas, the Red Cross excluded African Americans from donating blood, making Drew himself as the creator of this blood plasma mobile mobiles. It in policy excludes him, saying he can't give blood because he's Black, and eligible for the very program that he established. All right, so that policy was later modified to accept donations from Blacks. Okay, you're benefiting from having blood. However, the institution upheld racial segregation of blood. They have Black blood and white blood. There is no difference. We all bleed red for a reason. Period. Okay? And Charles Drew was insulted, as he rightfully should have been. I mean, he's still a scientist, so he's still working. Some Black people might say, oh, he should have quit. It's not that easy. When you're dedicated to something and you know you're still working on a scientific advancement and you're having to deal with all of the bullshit. So he criticized the American Red Cross and its practices as unscientific and insulting to African Americans. And here's a quote from Charles Drew. No scientific basis, there's never been any scientific basis to indicate any difference in human blood from race to race, because race is a social construct that white people created at the beginning of chattel slavery. Period. Which also means Black in America doesn't mean Black in Jamaica. Black in America doesn't mean Black in Brazil. Okay, and just because of those labels does not make it so. There is no difference, and they knew it. But they believe in white supremacy. That's why they carry these sort of things out. And that's why we have to know our history. All right, in his final days, the Spingarn Medal is like the highest honor of the NAACP still. And he received it in 1944 for his work. He actually died tragically, and died tragically young. Charles Drew died in North Carolina on April 1st, 1950. After falling asleep, he was driving to Tuskegee, Alabama. And he was given a blood transfusion, so it said, at an all-white hospital, but succumbed to the injuries. And that does happen sometimes. But it's because they also got him out of his car and assumed he was white. That's the only reason why he made it into that hospital. His family later wrote letters to those physicians thanking them for the care that they did provide, though. And it's just an unfortunate, it's tragic. But what he has contributed to Black history cannot be lost or forgotten. And part of the reason why he was falling asleep at the wheel is because Black people driving through the South couldn't stop anywhere to use the bathroom, not unless it was in trees. You couldn't go and get gas. They had to keep it together. You know, it wasn't until I got older I realized the reason why my grandfathers didn't like to stop when they were driving was because of the shame and embarrassment they had experienced in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, growing up, realizing that you can't go and use the bathroom, having people call you a nigger, having people throw rocks at you while you pee. So they adjusted to it because they didn't want to deal with the indignities of that. You know how dehumanizing that is? To not even be able to stop and use the bathroom. And Black people still aren't safe doing that today. So Dr. Virginia Alexander, because you know I'm always here, especially in this case, for Black women's empowerment. Dr. Virginia Alexander is the name all y'all need to know. All right. But I say kind of the best for last. I don't want to put right, I'm just playing, but like, okay. So Dr. Virginia Alexander, now she is also another one, like Charles Drew, who dies very young, but once again, does incredible things for Black maternal health care. All right. So Dr. Virginia Alexander, here's another picture of her. 1900 to 1949. Like I said, she dies young. Education, she had a master's degree in public health from Yale University. She attended the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania. Her specialties were obstetrics and gynecology. And guess what? She had Black women patients who she helped with their consent. Not like J. Marion Sims, who had a statue on Fifth Avenue for the longest in New York, giving him credit for founding obstetrics. And then they put that little thing like they always do, a disclaimer after Black people complain. And then eventually they took his statue after my students. I'm just saying, I'm not saying it happened because of my students, but shout out to my students for writing the city hall, okay? And asking for that statue to be taken down. Now it's in the Brooklyn Cemetery. Anyway, specialty obstetrics and gynecology and public health. The concept of public health, like these are issues that affect the public. And I'm not just a doctor that deals with people walking the door. I'm going to work to ensure that this information gets to other people and places. Shout out to Dr. Virginia Alexander. Now, she also worked with another Black woman. Shout out to collaboration. Another doctor by the name of Helen Dickens, and she's standing there. All right. Now, their medical work, once again, this is what I mean by organizing and using their resources, things they had, and honest to God, probably didn't have, was just making a way out of no way. Esperanto Health Home in Philadelphia in 1931. Dr. Virginia Alexander establishes this, and Dr. Helen Dickens works with her. What they did with this was they would take in women purposely, okay, not by accident, to care for the poorest members of their community. They noticed that their infant mortality rates were higher, and they wanted to help. It was the third largest African-American community in America at that time. Philadelphia was. And she established this hospital. Esperanto Health Home was in her actual house. Her house was the hospital. She lived there. That's how dedicated and committed she was to this. And they practiced general medical care and emergency treatment. And one of the amazing things that I think they did, and this is with her and Dr. Helen Dickens, they both delivered babies and ran parenting classes. All right, not in that condescending sense, like, oh, Black people don't know what to do with their kids. These are women who don't always get an opportunity for education because of segregation in the South, and they move up north many times just looking for work, and that's what they have to do. They don't know how to necessarily make sure they have the right kinds of protein running through their body to make sure they can breastfeed, to make sure they can provide for their kid. So those women were allowed to stay for a week to 2 weeks, and they'd run these classes to teach you how to deal with newborns. And not only to teach you, but to assist you in those early days. Everybody's not married when they have a baby. And just because they're married doesn't mean they get help from a man. So this is about also teaching women about their bodies and how to care for their children. This is radical work as far as I'm concerned. Now, if you want to know more about particularly Dr. Virginia Alexander, she wrote an article that was published in the Crisis magazine, which was edited by none other than W.E.B. Du Bois, who worked for the NAACP and created the Crisis magazine to expose issues that Black people were dealing with all over the United States to other Black people in the United States with the NAACP. And the title of this article is, "Can a Colored Woman Be a Physician?" She's writing this as a doctor, but she talks about the disparity, so on and so forth, and the experiences of Black women in trying to carry this out. And it's brilliant. You can look it up on Google Books. You can actually find a free copy of it. And I encourage you to do it. I can actually kind of put the link down. You have to scroll, of course, to look for it because it's an older newspaper that has been digitized, but it's accessible. And the baby, like in the picture, fun fact, is actually Du Bois's grandchild. So yeah, he publishes her work, but he also can attest to her work as a Black woman. And this is before Black men, there was even any sort of regular, because Black women have always spoken up for Black women, but before there is any sort of regular like demand for Black women's work to be acknowledged, W.E.B. Du Bois was doing that. Okay, and that is why I am proud to be a continuing Du Bois scholar as an individual. But yeah, and if you're ever interested in movies, or I already talked about this. Well, actually, before I do this, World War II. All right, she actually starts to travel. That's Virginia Alexander. Her, Charles Drew. They're traveling to help people who don't even like them as Black people. She helped coal and iron miners, poor whites, this included Black people, as well. Public health physician in Alabama. She goes to Alabama. And once again, Tuskegee University being a place that a lot of people knew where there was intellectual thought going on, and we can talk about the challenges with Tuskegee and Booker T. Washington and his tragic philosophy on how far Black people can make it. But nevertheless, anyway, she had she never had a lot of money to do this. Many patients couldn't afford to pay for their care. She still gave it. Services included 2 weeks of postnatal recuperation at the health home. You gave her what you could. I mean, the amount of grace. Like, you have to believe in something higher than you to make that kind of sacrifice and for God to bless you and continuously be able to do that work. She dies of lupus, an autoimmune disease that many Black women die of. And I still feel like that's why there's not a lot of research on it. As she was taking care of other people, young. She died at 49. All right. So I just like people to know about these things. Go look up Dr. Virginia Alexander. Go look up Dr. Helen Dickens. Go look up Dr. Charles Drew. Go look up Dr. Daniel Hill Williams. And if you can't find information, keep looking, keep researching, find your own to share. And if you're ever looking for movies, Something the Lord Made is a good one, not because it's good in a sense, the acting is good, but the story of another Black man, Vivian, oh God, why is his name escaping me? Anyway, he ends up working at Johns Hopkins, but he loses his money in the bank during the Great Depression, not because of anything he did, but because the bank shut down. He ends up working for this white man at Vanderbilt who is so impressed with all the medical knowledge he has and studies, allows him to be his research assistant, but almost like a slave. He only pays him a little bit, doesn't give him the notoriety, so on and so forth. By the end, John Hopkins has his name on the wall and has named things after him because he helped in the tragic disease, the blue babies, the babies who couldn't breathe and that sort of thing. Why is his name escaping me? Vivian, John Hopkins. Let's just see. Nope. I just want to hurry and do this. Johns Hopkins, Dr. Vivian, because I want y'all to know his name so y'all can look him up in case y'all don't watch the movie. But Mos Def actually plays him in the movie, and Gabrielle Union, one of her first parts, but you can't tell because she looks the same age as she always does. Vivian Thomas, but Vivien Thomas. Vivian Thomas. Go look him up. All right. Thank you guys. I want to do more of these. Thanks for listening. See you soon.